So it is very nearly 5 o'clock, and I'm ultra conscious of the fact that the only thing standing between you and beer is us. So we'll kick off and get started. I'm Steve Sharman, CTO of Mediasmiths. I'm going to be moderating this session, which is great because it means I don't have to say a lot. They have to do all the work. Fantastic. And I will ask these fine gentlemen to stop playing with their iPads and introduce themselves.
Okay, I'm Ian Wagdin. I'm Production Innovation Executive for Vision Productions based up at Salford. So I look after new ways of working for productions and transition from tape-based working to file-based working and post-production workflows and all that kind of stuff.
Hi, sorry.
Cool.
I'm Brian Hardman. Formerly, I was technical director at Sumner's Post-Production in Manchester for 14 years. Recently just joined the farm operation within the BBC in Media City, which we provide the operational layer for much of the internal facilities within the BBC in Media City. Working now very closely with Ian. So.
Marvellous. So the way we're going to play this is I'm just going to lob a few soft questions at the guys. If you we'll take some specific questions. We'll take some specific time for questions at the end. But if you have a burning issue that you wish to raise, then stick your hand up and feel free to heckle. So the title of this session is Are we delivering digital? Now we could have been really dull and thought, is this all about digital delivery, which is what Brian wanted to do. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to talk about. Interpret it as, are we delivering on the promise of digital? Because we've all spent collectively a long time putting together things like file-based workflows, transitioning technologies, and so on and so forth. Are we getting what we thought we'd get out of them? So, starting point really is, what did we think we were going to get out of file-based or digital when we started? Ian?
So it promised a lot, and I think it's delivered a fair amount, but I think we've still got a long way to go before we realise the full vision. Things like HD and 4K workflows and some of the higher end facilities that we now have available to us on very low power computers compared with 5-6 years ago, I think have really changed the way we're working. And you know, we produce virtually nothing now in SD, and the cameras, the file-based cameras, enable us to take file-based material, put it into a file-based edit system, do lots of fancy effects with it, store that media for some length of time, and then push it out to our audiences in different various ways. Have we delivered on the full promise to our audiences? I think if you were to look at it honestly in the area where I sit,
what would you say that promise would? Well, actually, it's two questions. What would you say that promise was, and what would you think the audiences would say that promise was?
So for me, it's about better sharing, better collaboration, the ability to shift files around a lot easier, to be able to trace stuff, store it more easily, not have boxes of media sitting on under desks and all that kind of stuff. For the audience, I think it's about making stuff available how they want it, when they want it, the anytime, any place, anywhere martini thing. And I think there have been some really big moves in that space. So the stuff sport did around the Olympics and some of the stuff news done, I think as an audience offering, have been absolutely groundbreaking. But I think we've still got a long way to go from some of our mainstream programmes.
Brilliant. So, Brian, I mean, you've been at the sharp end for a long time. What do you think was kind of promised by a move to digital, and how do you think we're doing with it?
I'm not convinced that actually, as far as, I don't think anything's been promised. I think it's chicken and egg situation, really. I think people realise the reality often after things have been presented. I think you mentioned the Olympics, that I think the concept of there was no promise 6 months before the Olympics. The audience weren't being necessarily didn't have a high expectation. They didn't know what was going to come, but actually they all got really enthused by the potential was what the sport team. Chris is here from sport. What the sport team did with the 24 channels on Red Button. I think that it's a chicken and egg situation. Everybody thought that was absolutely fantastic, but it wasn't an upfront promise as such. There's two issues here for me. One is there's what the audiences and from the broadcasters expect, and I'm coming at it from actually what on the production, on post-production, I think there's more promises in that, on that side in terms of how we make programs, and the promises really come from the manufacturing side of things. And my issue really, and those promises, is about joined-up thinking. And I think that's where a lot of the issues still sit. In terms of it's a lot of digital silos are being are created. But it's the joined-up piece that we've still got a lot of work to do on. I think.
No, absolutely. So that's pretty good. I mean, what's the whole idea of going joined up is I think it's something that everybody wants to do, but we all find it extremely difficult. I mean, why do we find it so difficult, do you think?
There's the old problem of standards and what is a standard, and every piece of kit, although it may conform to some standard around MXF or some sort of wrapper or something like that.
Not a standard.
So when is a standard, and it's very hard to kind of move things around. I think it's also, as Brian says, very manufacturer-led. So when Samsung or LG or Sony or Panasonic launch their latest television, it comes as a kind of smart TV badge, but we don't really know what that means for us as content makers.
See, that's a really interesting thing. You mentioned in all of those are consumer electronics manufacturers, and you mentioned those as opposed to sort of Avid or Quantel.
I mean, I think
is that indicative of kind of where you're thinking now?
Well, I think if I'm focusing on the audiences, that's the way the audiences interact, and you have those kind of groundbreaking moments. You know, we're both sitting here with iPads 2 years ago. You know, nobody had that concept of what a mobile tablet device would look like, and now, you know, a lot of homes have got them, and that whole second screen stuff is starting to become another way of delivering content. And for me, the guys you spoke about, Quantel, Avid, Apple, they are the enablers to help us deliver that content, and Adobe are the other ones who are obviously big in that space as well. And they're really enabling us to take that content, churn it round, move it out to the audiences. But actually the biggest factor is either time or manpower or know-how. And I don't really think that we fully understand yet what the offering is to the audience. And where you've got something very clearly defined, like a large sporting event, I think you can wrap something around that. But what does it mean for children's in Fiona's world? What does it mean for me in Vision around something like Songs of Praise? What does a fully digital program look like to a Sunday evening TV viewer? I
mean, it's a big question, isn't it? Does it basically just look like the most efficient program you can make, or does it look like something with which the audience can kind of interact on a second screen basis, and, you know, buy the sort of the CD of the hymn?
And how do we do it? And if you look at some content like The Apprentice or programs like that get a really big kind of Twitter following, how we interact with that is very, very different to how you'd interact on a large scale live event as well. And some of that stuff I don't think we've really harnessed in that way, and I don't think we know how to.
That's a pretty fair point, actually. So Brian, just going back to the point around manufacturers, and I think collectively we all look at manufacturers as software guys, as people that should be enabling what we do. To what extent is that? Do you think that's true? And to what extent there's still a kind of a big battleground out there, and people are trying to some guys are trying to kind of get some advantage and sell over other guys and so on?
I think that practically, I think there's a massive education issue, which I think there's been a disconnect between manufacturers and how we educate production. And we see that almost daily. I think, we were in a situation 5 years ago where production was pretty stable. You had one of, for Sausage Factory, what I call Sausage Factory mainstream television, but its production was pretty stable. And you either shot it, in simple terms, you either shot it on Digi or you shot it on DV. A lot of those production teams are still the core production teams, and there's now the manufacturers, as we know, there's a codec a week or a camera a week. And the manufacturers just presume that everybody out there is a techie, and the education piece, I think there's a real piece missing between manufacturers and existing production houses and broadcasters, and also the big thing to me is the universities. And we're seeing, fortunately, we are seeing on Media City quite good collaborations between the likes of Adobe and the university, which I think is really important. Now, there's a big difference between them just doing it and as a marketing exercise, and actually delivering realistic targets of education through that. And I think those partnerships are really key moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's an area that I think you're both right. We don't actually go into enough, the whole kind of training and realising it's not just tools; it's things that people actually have to use from day to day.
Yeah, I mean, I quote, 2 years ago at BVE we did a few seminars.
Yeah.
And then at that stage we were talking about a 70-30 split between tape-based acquisition and file-based. It's now the world has changed dramatically in the last 2 years, and there has been a few educational efforts within the community, but most people are learning on the job.
Yeah.
And there's just a huge amount to learn now, and I think the efforts that, thank God for the BBC Academy and people like that who are still trying to get their head around these issues, because I still think there's a massive education issue, because suddenly APs, for example, could go out and they knew how to use a camera, but they didn't really know the in-depth knowledge of the menu settings, and they didn't have to worry about codecs, and they didn't have to worry about frame rates and stuff like that. That's a massive issue now, because they do have to understand that.
Yeah.
And it's how do we educate and get people back into... So you can think a digital camera looks fairly straightforward and it's point and press, and it absolutely isn't. And those are the realistic issues. So yes, it's the enabler is quicker, faster, better, cheaper.
Yeah.
Is kind of what the digital promises to deliver, if you like. Actually, from a post and production point of view, we're seeing some benefits, but if you take a step back, we're not gaining most of those benefits because there's a huge education gap, I think.
And I think I'd echo a lot of that, and I think actually one of the big things is that we don't have one standard for being able to even just view files. So if I record on a Canon camera, I've got a different way of viewing stuff to if I record on a P2 camera, which is different again if I record on a Sony camera or an Arri camera or any of the other things. So we don't have a kind of standardised way of kind of treating this media. So the post houses and the stuff Brian does becomes ever more critical. And we're spending a lot of time trying to focus on, actually, how do I just view my content? When the old days I just kind of walked up and put it into
a tape machine,
put it in a tape machine and push play. And so some of that is actually is more handcuffs than freeing. And I think the original vision of being able to see stuff and share it and move it around and stuff relies on quite heavy processes at the beginning of the chain in terms of transcode. That's interesting.
I guess we've always been in a situation where people have had different tape standards depending on the outputs they need. But is it the fact that that you can almost kind of change software and codecs willy-nilly, and you can get a much faster kind of beat rate on it because you don't have to worry about hardware in the meantime that's driving some of this?
I think some of that is true. I mean, I wouldn't want to put down the benefits of things like different frame rates, or the fact that we can now shoot 4K or on full HD on compact flash cards. I think some of that it really has delivered a creative benefit to the audience. And I hate that term creative benefit because I'm not quite sure what it means. But
I was going to say, define creative benefit.
But how? What is that? What is that single mechanism? And we've talked a little bit about collaboration, and I think probably now's the time to mention things like the DPP.
Yeah.
So those of you who aren't familiar with the DPP in the room, that's a digital production partnership, and it's a partnership between the broadcasters, between ITV, BBC, and Channel 4, and they're working quite closely together to try and not only define clear workflow practices, because I think what we're seeing quite a lot is that we get people coming in from indies. They may have used some of this stuff with one company, and then it's a different practice to when they come into the BBC, and it's probably a different practice at ITV and Channel 4. So how do we start to mould that, and then also trying to wrap some standards around things like delivery and how we deliver that into our broadcast chains?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hate to say it because I know you guys are under pressure as well, but I think one of the key things about DPP is that the broadcasters have actually got the kind of the people and the time to take a lot of these issues into consideration and work them through. Whereas of course indies are being squeezed just like everybody else is, and they don't have it. So I mean that to me is kind of a big advantage. It's really taking that knowledge and spreading it to the world in a very open format.
Yeah, and I think as the BBC we've always had a little bit of a brief to do that, but it is hard. What is the best practice? What does that look like? What's the best way of storing this stuff? What's the best way of sharing it? What can you really do? And then ultimately, if you create something like an app that goes, and you're an indie and you've created an app that goes with your program, who actually owns that app, and where does the intellectual property rights and stuff like that sit? And I think that's a bit of a challenge going forward, not only for the broadcasters but for the indies as well. Definitely.
Just coming back to the issue of education, because I think that is a really important one. I mean, to both of you, what would a kind of I think certainly my experience with talking to, say, the University of Salford and others is that they want a lot more interaction with business because they know how to do things, but they don't have the day-to-day interaction with it that you guys do. So what would a kind of really rounded, good graduate look like to you?
I think the conversations, I've had quite a lot of involvement with Salford University here, and the conversations we've had is very much around, as you say, getting much more real-world exposure. And I think there's a realisation in education now as well, in terms of their whole finance model has to change, because people now, as we all know, want much more of a guarantee of work coming out of these things. I think that there is the technology piece, but I think also these days it's much more about producing people who are much more multi-skilled and not going down one particular avenue, and also getting the big piece that we've identified in the kind of operation that we're involved with is there is roles now within the BBC and technically on Media City that didn't exist or are not well known, or people at university don't realise that these roles exist, and that's a big piece now. There's various identified roles we have which are related to all the digital workflow aspects. There's ingest and quite a few positions around ingest which are really important and people coming out of university aren't aware of the actual roles that we're defining now. So we need to get an understanding of what the new roles are in there quickly, so they can see that. But it's much more a jack of all trades. People need to have a lot of digital skills now in different aspects, and be prepared to soak up real world when they come out, in much more than they ever used to have.
Yeah, I mean, I remember sort of way back when I was kind of doing almost kind of a standard IT job, not a broadcast IT job. I quite often get consulted on HR about what sort of people should be hiring, and to me it was always I need people that can actually kind of understand problems, break them down, and actually think them through. Specific technologies you can learn. But having a good, solid problem-solving approach and a curious mind, you can't necessarily teach that, which is a bit of a problem.
But I also think it's about not losing the magic that you kind of have as as a youth, and the willingness to explore some new. Because actually, previously, what we've done in the past is that people will get very well trained up. And then they'd come into somewhere like the BBC, and then we'd beat it out of them and tell them how it was really done in the real world. And I think far more now, we're absolutely recognising that our audiences are, we're competing against the YouTubes and the Twitters and the Vimeos of this world to actually get the content out there. And the people who really understand that are not the people like me who've worked for the BBC for so long now. I'm following the trend, but actually those guys who are kind of coming in are
the ones
digital
natives.
Yeah, they recoined that phrase from 5 years ago. But it's that kind of real fundamental understanding of how people want to interact with each other that maybe people like me and you and Brian probably have lost a little bit.
So what you're saying is we are basically past it.
We're dinosaurs.
Pretty much. So that's always good to hear on a whatever day this is. So thanks for that. That's pretty good. So, kind of another sort of bit of a wide-ranging question, which is, I think if you look at the way that technology has changed some industries, in particular things like retail, financial services, logistics, it's actually led to completely different businesses and completely different ways of working that you almost couldn't have imagined without having technology in place. Do you think we've seen anything like that in our industry? And if not, why not? And if so, what is it?
So I think our fundamental, and sometimes as Brian alluded to earlier, we kind of get wrapped up in the technology and stuff like that, but actually the fundamental thing that we do well is about storytelling. And it's about content, and it's about actually the quality of that content and delivering that content. The platform or how we make it is an enabler to that. It's not the be all and end all. And I think you could probably be very creative on film, when you could be very creative on you know, if you drew it out and published it by hand. But the fact that we can deliver to far more people in far more different ways, in far more places, I think does fundamentally change what we do and what we need to think about how we do it. And
so it actually changes us as storytellers and how we tell stories.
And as I mentioned earlier, you know, when you are really competing with people who can just pick up an iPhone, you know, and there are a couple of iPhone apps out there now that enable you to shoot video, and they will edit it together for you, and they'll lay a music track under it, and will deliver it out. Now, that's fine. That's a piece of technology that does what Brian and I have been doing for a few years now. But if the story's no good, nobody's going to want to watch it. So you know, digital is an enabler. It's not the be all and end all. We still need those kind of really strong creative producer directors who are.
It's all about the content.
And actually, our role should be about making what they deliver easier. And actually, I think sometimes at the moment...
Do you think we do?
What I was going to say, I think at the moment, I think we're making it harder for them in some ways, because, you know, we're constantly battering onto them about standards or metadata, or they can use this camera but not that camera, and they can, we'd like them to use that edit system. And I think sometimes that can feel like a creative set of handcuffs.
That's kind of a question I was going to ask you, really, which is, with all the change that we've had to make over a past of X number of years, how much change have we actually made, which is just all about kind of because we have to, and because we're almost kind of doing it to stand still? And how much of that change has kind of been real sort of positive move forward?
I think if you do take a step back, I think we're on the cusp of significant change in production, but I don't think we're actually at that stage yet. In as you say, in terms of aids of making storytelling easier, I think we have, because we are going. You know, the reality is we're going through a major revolution. We're at the tail end of a major revolution over the last 18 months, and I think a lot of production creatives feel that there's some freedom in terms of getting much nicer pictures easier,
right?
But actually, in the general tool set, there's been more barriers put in place, I think, than there ultimately will be, and the benefits will be found. I think where we have got turning it on its head, the major obvious changes is in the delivery piece. As I mentioned earlier, the 24 channels on the red button is where the major changes are be, and people are having to think about creating the second screen and that kind of stuff. But I think in terms of pure production, talking about storytelling-based production, live's different.
Yeah, sure.
But storytelling production, I don't think we have changed. I don't think there has been a significant change, and I think many production people will say that actually there's more barriers currently because they're having to adhere to, well, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that.
That doesn't work with that. You need to
and so I think we'll be sat here in 12 to 18 months' time, and I think a lot of that will be freed up. I'm really hopeful that we will get back to, as I said earlier, the digibeta or DV option.
Sure.
In a digital form. I don't think we're there yet.
They were both digital, bro.
Sorry?
DV and Digi were both Digi.
Exactly.
Clues in the name.
But I think we will get back to, and I think that there are pieces in the jigsaw which, as Ian said, you know, things like, this is what I said about joined-up thinking from the manufacturers. There are pieces in the jigsaw like Rush's viewing, which only now we're starting to see the reality of people like A-Frame and Foreseen and people like that being used as a standard tool. It was a bit of a luxury before. But even those are not, they're far from perfect.
Is that sort of because they are sort of I mean, obviously they're good systems in their own right, but is that also partly because we're solving a workflow problem? Because we haven't got kind of standard tools for, as Ian was saying, things like reviewing rushes, so therefore we're giving the problem to somebody else to solve?
Yeah, there's too many choices at the moment, and I think each choice has its limitations. That's the problem at the moment. There's not a default situation, but I think we'll get there. I think had there been much more of a joined up approach, who would have led this, I'm not sure, but from the manufacturers, I think there's just not been the joined up approach you would like to think.
Do you think?
I think just to echo that, I think we've got a lot of Japanese camera manufacturers, and we've got a lot of American post-production manufacturers, and actually we're in the middle, literally, and we're kind of pulled in both directions.
Together,
and actually, just looking around the show floor today, as I have been. I haven't seen any tape vendors, and I think it's probably the first major show that I've been to that I haven't seen any tape vendors. Has anyone seen a tape-based camera out there on the show floor? They just don't exist anymore, and in some ways that's because the manufacturers have kind of led us down this way. But in some ways, I think it has been what we've asked for. You know, okay, you can do HD on tape, but you can't do off frame rate shooting, and you can't do better file sharing and stuff like that. What we haven't yet nailed as a broadcaster, and I think A-Frame and Forseen are fairly good examples of how do we better share that content. So in stills photography we can do it. We can do it really easily. I can take a picture, I can put it on Facebook, I can put it on Twitter, I can share it, and I can do a collaborative edit on it. I can send it off to somebody on the other side of the world to do it. We need to get there with video, and I think print got there some time ago, but we're not there with broadcasting.
Yeah, interesting. They are suffering a lot of the things, a lot of the kind of those problems even now, but they are starting, I think, to come out of it. Just being sort of slightly cynical about it as well. Do you think the fact that we're coming from effectively a number of years where there was a lot of money around and people could afford to come out with lots of different standards and buy lots of different kit, and we're really moving into a world now where there isn't so much money around in the general economy as well as what we do? Do you think is that going to shake things up and force people to work together a bit more, or is it just mean that we will have equally large problems, just fewer of them?
I think we all know there's an economic reality, and going back to the original premise, which is the promise of digital. I think because it hasn't been as joined up as it needs to be, then the cost. As I said, it's quicker, better, faster, cheaper has been the promise, and I think we've not achieved that. And the squeeze on, as another example, the squeeze on schedules in most broadcast programming forces the technology just has to work. And because it's not stable, and there's still a lot of incompatibility in the chain and all that kind of stuff. Then it really squeezes the pinch points of where the technology's not quite there yet. I think we're not far off. We're very close. But the economic reality, that the promise of digital, if you like, or the promise of file-based, and we've not even got onto file-based delivery, but that's a whole other area of pain coming. But I think we're a lot closer than we were, but it's still not. I think the economics of program production is squeezing the technology and really squeezing where actually some of it just doesn't work. But there is more that does now than there was 12 months ago.
I'd echo that, and sometimes it does feel like a bit of a minefield, and you're still picking up hangovers from old ways of working, where people have kind of got a hold of an idea and they kind of won't let it go. And I'd also echo that bit around delivery, because actually for the first time we've recognised, again as part of the DPP, but as broadcasters in general, that actually we need to drive what those standards look like. And I think in the past we've let the manufacturers drive a lot of those standards, and that's maybe not wrong, and I think the manufacturers are kind of stepping back and taking a sigh of relief in the file-based delivery space and saying, well, actually, you tell us...
They've got a spec to work to now.
You tell us actually how you want to work it. You set the standard, which we've done with AS11. For those of you not familiar at it, Google it, because I'm not going to explain it now. But
it's incredibly dull.
Us setting a standard that the manufacturers can then work to help us deliver on that thing, I think, is actually a little bit of a change in and how we make it work. And certainly as broadcasters, I think we've recognised that we need to work with our colleagues a lot more. And gone are the days when, ITV could do something different to Channel 4 to us.
Yeah.
So
should we be doing more of that right up and down the chain? The chain?
I think we're trying to, and I think we're trying to involve the indies and the manufacturers as kind of part of that.
Yeah.
Triumphant, if you want.
It's probably a different question to ask because Media City isn't kind of fully populated up and running yet. But one of the promises of Media City was that we were going to get that kind of community where lots of different people would give us lots of different choice around how we could do things. But the central ethos was working together. Are we starting to see that? Do you think?
That was laid down maybe in a slightly different economic climate. And so there's some economics around that companies can't afford to move perhaps on campus as perhaps they could have done when the vision was first laid out. I think we are starting to see it. I think it's a little bit alien to us, so working with our competitors and stuff like that. ITV have just started moving onto site.
Yeah, sure.
We're showing a car park. Well, that's great. I'm sure we'll be sharing a few bars and maybe even maybe even meet over a coffee in the morning and stuff like that. But these are the same people that we know. We're in the same industry.
Yeah.
We come all each other, and a lot of because we're so reliant on freelancers, people move between the two companies.
Yeah.
So the more we can do to kind of actually join up what digital production looks like, I think is going to be a benefit to everyone. And actually, it's not about the tools; it is about the people, and it is about that vision and the stories that they can tell. And in some ways, as technologists or as post-production providers, we need to get back into that service mentality to say, okay, what's your big vision? How do we help you deliver that? Rather than kind of being blockers saying, oh, well, I wouldn't do it that way.
So, Brian, so knocking the googly to you, you're kind of double bubble because your farm's been up running for a while, but you've only been there for a little while. As a provider of services in Media City, is that kind of understanding kind of there's a real focus on the BBC? Is there an ambition and a kind of a focus to look at spreading your wings more in that community?
Not at the moment, because we've got a very firm commitment of what we've got to deliver to the BBC, and we see our role. There's the farm. People know the farm as we are, generally perceived as a large post-production outfit. The setup at the BBC is quite different in that we're providing an operational layer. We see our role very much. What the farm's always done is to grow talent, and that's going back to what I said earlier about the universities.
Part of the education thing.
It's really important that we grow talent. We see, as with the operational layer, that the talent piece is our responsibility across BBC Sport, across post-production that covers all the other departments. So that, as far as the responsibility on Media City is concerned, we take that piece really seriously. Sure. It's not so much as far as what we deliver technically. We're very much tied by our relationship delivering the BBC vision internally.
Sure.
But it's actually about the operational layer. So therefore, what we're doing is actually about the talent, and that's why we've got. I'm very keen on the partnerships. We've got the university, and also there's a major skill set initiative as well, which is centred around Media City, which I think is a really important initiative as well moving forward.
So in many ways, your kind of contribution, even though you're not looking to kind of spread outside the BBC for now, is to start to kind of bring the skills of the people up into those kind of ways of working that we're looking for. Yeah,
we see that as our primary responsibility.
Okay,
definitely.
There's just a sort of a bit of an odd one, which is a kind of practices question, which is. Do you think are there any lessons that we've forgotten from the kind of our tape and film days? That if we actually sort of cleared our minds a little bit and went back to them, we might solve some of the problems that technology's given us.
Yeah.
I thought you'd like that one.
It depends how far you want to go back, but and certainly before my time. But I think there's also some assumptions that we've made that we're starting to realise perhaps were wrong. I mean, I think we were having a discussion yesterday, and I think we kind of always made the assumption that if we give people tools to pre-select media, they wouldn't take as much stuff into post-production.
Yeah.
And therefore we could scale our post-production down offering because everyone would do things at their desktop and earlier in the chain.
How's that going for you?
Well, I think the reality is that people have shot stuff, they kind of want to bring it into the edit.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge. And actually they want to have their skilled person to have all of the resources available to them, and they don't necessarily feel that they're the right person to make that decision early on in the chain. And the more kind of collaborative junior people you have working on that stuff, they're very reluctant to sort of start throwing stuff away. And going back to before my time, but I did have a Super 8 film camera. You know, you had 4 minutes to record on a roll of film there, and you were pretty economical with it, and you could only afford one camera. And I think actually what digital has enabled,
maybe 200 to 1's a bit high.
Well, that's low actually in some of our programs.
Really?
But yeah, I mean, you know, we do the proliferation of things like GoPros and cheap handheld cameras and other cameras are available. Are
not endorsed by the BBC.
Yeah, we you know, every single day now it's possible to go out with my iPhone, and I'm sure we've probably, I was just sitting here, we've probably got 5 or 6 video cameras in our pockets and between us, and so it's very easy to kind of overcover events and be tempted just to kind of spray and pray and shoot everything, and that's really hard. So again, it comes back to storytelling. Yeah. And
I think there's you're absolutely right. I mean, for many, the number of times we've had it, I think, you know, most people in this room will have had the conversation of looking back at the good old days and saying, well, give them a can of film, and that's the discipline. But actually, the reality is that I think we are starting to see a bit more sense now, because people are aware of, are becoming more aware of the issues of overshooting, the technical challenges in terms of storage, which hit people at various points in the chain. But I think the focus now on metadata and the importance of the reusability of material, and that message is now firmly being hammered home in the production community from the larger, certainly within the BBC, in the value of the archive, and how important the labelling of it up front. And what I've seen within the BBC, and this is the same in other large production houses, is discipline is being brought back into it, because because of the value of the archive is being seen as being really important. And the whole metadata piece, which there have been other presentations today about the importance of metadata, is starting to focus people's minds. And reality is as well that people are realising that there still is cost involved with storage. And the fundamental thing as well of when you say editors want to see all their stuff, when you sit in an edit suite and you've got 200 hours to wade through, guess what? It takes 200 hours to watch it.
I'm not sure it's the editors who want to see it, it's the producers who think the editors might want to see it.
So it's quite interesting. We went through this with, you know, 5-6 years ago with DV, and DV was the proliferation of the 500 and 600 hour projects. And money wasn't as tight then, so they did used to spend 6 weeks viewing rushes before they started a job. That's kind of, you know, the schedule. Going back to what I said earlier about schedules, that's all come down now.
Sure.
So I think it's coming full circle in some respects, and the disciplines required. And it's quite interesting talking to some of the students who are getting excited about 2K and 4K now, which is, and you're going, hang on a minute. But actually, it's quite interesting developing that conversation with them, because they said, oh, but I can only get 4 minutes on my card shooting 4K. And they're really excited about 4K, but actually, great, let them do it, because it forces that discipline.
Yes.
So in many ways, it's
going full circle. What was that about your Super 8 film?
Well, no, I actually will. I do have a real life experience of this, because I did a program that I think Brian probably post-produced about 5 years ago on P2, and the biggest card we had was a 4 gig card, so we could shoot 4 minutes on the card, and it had 5 slots in it, and I had to download the content halfway through and then reshoot it and or reuse the cards, and and actually now we've kind of got to a space where 64 gig cards are the norm, and they're, 32 gig cards are very cheap now, and so we've got this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sure.
And actually, some ways I'd say, please, can we just have 16 gig cards for everyone, and make that the discount? But it's not going to happen.
We'll take away some of the things that you've got. Yeah, absolutely. So Eve gave me my 10-minute warning about 5 minutes ago. So just one quick question to both of you, which is what are the bright spots on the horizon?
For me, I think it's about control, and I actually, again, we haven't touched on file-based delivery, but I think actually the one place where we still have a significant amount of tape in the chain is in our delivery mechanisms, and we still put tapes on vans at the end of the chain and send them down. I think that will.
There's a lot of bandwidth in the van.
Yeah, there's a lot of bandwidth in the van, and. But it is a limitation of what we have to do, and it kind of does still. We're still very much focused onto that big box in the corner of the room, and I'd really like to kind of see us get to a place where we can share this stuff better, and we can generate it and learn, certainly in long form documentary television, kind of learn some of the lessons from sport and news about actually how do we deliver more of this stuff to our audiences and stuff like that.
So more kind of communication, collaboration, education,
more two-way
really.
conversations and stuff like
absolutely.
that. I think.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I think you're absolutely right. I think the one piece, the major piece in the chain which affects timescales and it affects cost massively is the delivery piece, and this is why the DPP work is really important, I think, for the production chain. Not only, there's two prongs to the DPP. One is the actual technical standards, which is firmly focused on file-based delivery, but the other is the educational piece about the digital revolution and the seminars and stuff that they're doing. But on the delivery front, just to give you an example, we're as the farm, we're looking, one of our productions is Deal or No Deal, which we do in Bristol, and we're desperate to get that onto file-based delivery because it obviously cuts timescales down, but fundamentally there's a big issue with SR decks at the moment, apart from the obvious cost issue, is that nobody has really bought an SR deck in the last 18 months. So there's a lot of aged SR decks out there, and it's a major problem with most of the broadcasters. There's now major issues with compatibility between SR decks. That even newly lined up refurbed SR decks, there's a major compatibility issue between those. So you deliver to a broadcaster and they fail it because it won't play on their machine. These are real issues that hopefully we're just going to get rid of with file-based delivery. So in terms of what's on the horizon, the whole delivery piece is really important because we don't have to go out and spend 70 grand on SR decks anymore. But it's becoming a real logjam in production, in delivery of programs now. And Deal or No Deal, we're really keen to get that on a file-based delivery because we're literally putting SR tapes on trains every week. And we have to do two on different trains. So those are just ridiculous in this day and age. The kind of ridiculous practical. And I know it's the same with Channel 4 with Lime and are doing the same for Hollyoaks. They're putting stuff on trains to deliver, and that's got to go. And so there is major, and that will free up budget time hopefully. I think there's some grief along the way when we switch over.
Always is.
Sorry?
There always is.
Yeah, there's a bit of grief that moment that we go down the AS11 DPP spec delivery. And we haven't even mentioned loudness yet, which is a whole area of grief that's
we learned about that one. 128. We did a bit of work on that one.
So, is that the time?
We'll sort all that out. So I think the delivery piece now is really important.
Marvellous, thank you. Anybody like to make any comments or questions from the floor?
Go on, Janet.
Thanks very much. Janet West, R&D, the BBC. Digital revolution, you've talked about quicker, faster, this sort of thing. We've talked about education, and you talked about the cost and how the economy's changed. One of the costs that you haven't talked about is the environmental cost. At BBC R&D, we've done research to look at what the energy difference is, for example, over DTT versus over IP. And with Second Screen producing more and more content onto more and more platforms, we have an environmental cost not only of energy, but also a growing stream of electronic waste. What's the tipping point going to be in this industry to make people sit up and be aware? And is it going to be, as you pointed out with education, is it going to be the younger generation coming in to this industry sort of saying, hey, I love the techie toys, guys, but we can't do this. My kids want to have somewhere to live in this planet. So I just love your comments.
Yeah, well, I think it's a nice cue for tomorrow's session. So if you're here at 3 o'clock tomorrow, Janet and I will be discussing that a little bit more. I think you're right. I think it's a huge problem. As you know, data centres, which we rely on, are I think they're the second worst offenders in the world of environmental crime, secondary to the airlines. So, you know, the more we rely on storing stuff in data centres and having this data, that's a concern. So we again, it's one of those things that we need to start paring this stuff down and not just keeping everything, and really starting to think about actually what has real value to us. And what do our audiences want, rather than actually I'm a producer, I just want to keep that because it looked pretty and you know I want to keep it forever. I can't quite hear you, sorry.
Microphone.
Yeah.
Steve.
And just kind of moving on while you come back to that, I think you know, with people like yourselves kind of talking to the manufacturers a lot more about how we can recycle some of this kit, how we can make it more sustainable in its delivery, I think is quite key to us as well. We can't ignore it. I think it's a huge issue for us.
I think you're right. I don't know if you've had any discussions specifically with the likes of Salford and to get a module in on their current courses would be fantastic. I think that's where it's going to come from. Yeah. You know, these are exactly the practical issues that the universities are saying. What do we need to do? In terms of this piece.
The BBC, actually, we're driving an initiative because no one company can actually solve the problem on its own. So we're driving an initiative to work with the universities and the broadcast manufacturers to say, hey, what does broadcasting look like in 2050? It's not going to be even more content or more platforms, etc. And
actually, it's a real financial business cost for us as well because of the carbon taxes we pay and that kind of stuff. But we'll be discussing more of that tomorrow.
I think it's a really interesting one, but I think it also is something that comes from the top, because if you look at the broadcast that's probably made most steps towards actually being carbon neutral and actually really considering its environmental impact, it's Sky. And you know, it comes from James Murdoch saying we are going to be a carbon neutral broadcaster.
I think it depends how you define it, and
you're right,
I think Sky actually don't make a lot of their own content, so you know they're a distributor rather than
they don't. But
and so it depends how you count the.
They do actually.
And Janet knows far more about that kind of stuff than I do, and she's smiling at me because. Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. But I mean, Sky have certainly badged it out there, and certainly the BBC are very keen on looking forward to and things like Albert and stuff like that, and just kind of looking at the whole carbon footprint of what production means. I think it's a separate subject to digital, though. Although you know, with a half an eye in the future, we certainly need to. There's no point in delivering a whole bunch of content if the planet doesn't exist. So we've really got to get a grip of that.
Really? Have you seen certain Sky channels? Anyway, anybody else?
You touched on it before, talking about skill sets and people needing problem-solving skills rather than specific training on applications. Now, how would we go about? You know, personally, I'm an IT technician, audio-video technician. I've studied media technology, but to get that real-world exposure, how would we go about doing that? A lot of us feel like sometimes we're outside of the club and we want to try and get hands-on because some of these job roles mention specific packages or specific systems that we've just not seen. What would you recommend?
Well, I think a lot of the owners, there are some significant initiatives starting to now actually become reality, certainly around Media City. As I say, Skillset are doing a couple of valuable pieces of work at the moment to extend the opportunities to the wider community. And I think, if you're involved with it, it comes back when you're choosing courses. Salford are doing a lot of CPD courses as well now, which are not the traditional 3-year degree course or whatever, but CPD modules centred around a lot of. They will basically they're desperate to put modules together that are relevant to what's going on. So the whole education piece is changing quite dramatically now, and because they've obviously got a financial model to meet, so they have to make it relevant. Yeah. So I think that it's tough. I mean, it's not there isn't a magic bullet to this, but what we're seeing around Media City, we're starting to see the vision now of. As I say, the CPD, the skill set have got basically skill set. Go on their website, but they've got basically £1 million fund which has been centred around Media City to look at, and they're now looking at how they spend that money, and that will be many pronged. And we're the likes of the BBC and ourselves and other suppliers on Media City are keying into that now. Because we need to.
Thanks, Brian. We had, I think we had Noah at the back.
You were talking about file-based working and then file-based delivery, but how about file-based archiving? And also what happens to the current archiving with all post houses having probably a whole room full of tapes, and what happens to that? And does it get converted? Does it get dropped? Does it?
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So it's a challenge, and actually. We need to join up, both for Janet's point, because there's no point in the post house storing exactly the same content in data centres that we're storing in our own environment. I don't think. So if you kind of ask what a digital archive is, are we talking about rushes, or are we just talking about flattened files that kind of go into the archive as a la tape? So I think we've certainly looked at what an archive will look like, and this morning's first session from BBC Scotland was very much focused around that. I think the key thing is about making that stuff findable, and that's what digital does enable us to do. So in the old days, a tape on a shelf or a film canister means nothing, but actually in a modern world, we need to concentrate on how we make that stuff findable and searchable, and with that, it makes it more reusable and actually adds value to that archive. And the BBC, okay, we do stuff with the Motion Gallery, but ITN Source and stuff like that, actually recognising that that's actually a very deep source of revenue for a lot of companies, and I think there's a whole bunch of stuff around rights issues and stuff like that, but actually just being able to see it and find it, I think is one of the key things.
Again, I think you've hit on another one of the, from a practical point of view, this is where it's again not joined up very well. There isn't a we should be sat here saying all digital content should be archived in this format, and we're not. I mean, it's kind of, that's where the joined up bit doesn't work. Everybody's got LTO4, LTO5, LTO whatever, written with different types of software. Can you take an LTO tape and put it into another drive? No. So that's a massive disconnect. There isn't. We're still. That's why consultants get paid lots of money to solve these issues, and they still haven't solved them.
Yeah.
So. This is what the picture isn't joined up, and there is big issues around archive in terms of how it's stored and that haven't been addressed as an industry. I don't think.
And I don't think you could go out there and find an archive provider. You could find many manufacturers who can provide you a tool to run your own archive, but you won't find it as a service provision. And to me, that's a little bit of a shame, because I think actually in some ways it's something that post houses in India should almost be able to buy off the shelf. And I know that there's kind of long-term stuff in there, but there's no manufacturer kind of standing up there saying, you know what, I can provide you an archive storage in the same way that we're starting to see in the kind of photographic and print world.
Yeah, I mean, interesting enough, Amazon are making.
Just give you a business idea. Do you like that?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Amazon are starting to make. I'm surprised he's not here and shouting, actually. Amazon's starting to make baby steps towards that with their new Glacier service, but the kind of the cost of getting stuff on and off are sort of quite prohibitive, so there's still some work to do there. So, anybody else? Hey.
Hi there. I work for a broadcast post-production unit, and I'm very interested in the standardisation of formats and how they sort of flow through systems and how they work. If you touched briefly on DigiBeat, and obviously that was adopted back in the 80s, and there was considerable cost all of the broadcasters adopted to it, and it became a standard which stuck with us for around 25 years. Now, there's obviously a massive cost implication for broadcasters to move away from digibeta onto new formats, but the face of the landscape is changing so fast now. So standardisation would be a nice thing, but is it a realistic goal when, as you say, tomorrow a different camera and a different codec will come out? Or do you need to standardise the format or the pipeline through which it flows, if you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't think we have the answer yet, but I think what we do understand, or one of the promises around digital, and I think it's yet to be seen, is actually when that next generation of archive comes along, actually it's a lot easier to convert a file than it is, there's a much publicised D3 problem in the BBC, where we just don't have enough heads to play the amount of tape content that we've got. And that will happen with Digi, I'm sure, at some point in the future, although there's a lot more digibeta decks out there. But actually, one of the beauties of a file-based world is it's just ones and noughts, and if you can find a bit of software that reads it, the chances are you can put it into the next flavour. But we certainly haven't got to that stage yet. We're only just defining what those standards should be, and I think we are defining what those standards are. AS11 is one of those, and AS11 is basically an AVCI file with a metadata shim wrapped around it, and actually I think the key bit is that metadata, so it's how is that file, what's on that file. So again, a digibeta box, I could get a tape out. If it hasn't got a tape label on it, or it hasn't got a bit of paper in it telling me what it is, it's a useless piece of tape, and at some point I won't have the deck to play that on.
Yeah,
I think that there's, as we all know, technology, you're not going to stop it. But I think the AS11, the DPP thing, keep going back to this, but it's a line in the sand, which is really important. And if you extrapolate that back, in terms of, hopefully, it may be that we do have a stable situation for for how long, I'm not sure. But as Ian said, that's got the initial spec for AS11 is its AVCI codec is buried within that. That is a line in the sand, and if you, as I say, if you follow that back, then the natural thing is that you try, wherever possible, that you're talking about AVC content going in at the front end.
And if everything's the same when we pull those files back, then we'll have a mechanism to transfer.
Yeah,
also for SD content includes IMX50 as well. So.
Yeah, it's a very important line in the sand, because it's also a line in the sand that has all of the broadcasters in the UK forcing people to stick to it. So it's not like sort of previous versions of, say, MXF OP1A, well, it's your version or it's his version or it's her version or whatever. It's actually something which you're going to enforce.
And the DPP have kind of written metadata tools around that puts minimum metadata sets in there that we're now providing out to the manufacturers as well. So hopefully they'll adopt those and take those forward.
I think that's...
Have we overrun? Is the bar closed?
Can we go now?
Yeah.
You may not, until you are thanked. So, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for listening and participating. Hope it was useful to you.
Thank you.